Humans are annoyingly complex. When it comes to creating a survey that other people will take, you would like to just be able to put some questions down on a piece of paper and have the participants honestly and accurately answer those questions. Unfortunately, the question itself isn't the only thing that your participant is going to be responding to. The way the question is written, the language that is used, by language I just mean like the wording that is used, but yeah, actually the language as well. For like bilingual individuals, it makes a big difference as to whether you give them the survey in one form or another. It can bias their responses. So yeah, there's a lot of things that could be in your survey affecting your participants' responses, from the things I mentioned to the participants' current state. You know, maybe they're just a little hungry, maybe they're just a little cranky, whatever. You know, this kind of flippant, like little mood change can have dramatic influence. Another one is another thing that can affect the responses is any recent stimuli they've been exposed to. So if they've been in a particularly hot environment, or if they saw something particularly surprising, that could affect them. Another one is just various environmental factors, like how bright it is or what time of the day it is. And all these factors combined make it very hard to take the participants' responses as they are. You always have to consider the fact that what your participant wrote down on that survey could be influenced by any one or all of these kinds of factors. So in order to try to figure out exactly what's going on in the participant's head, we've developed something called the cognitive model of processes involved in responding to a survey item. So this comes from research by Sudman, Bradburn, and Schwartz. And they argue that in order to respond to a survey question, participants must do the following. So step one is to try to figure out what the question is asking, to interpret that question. Step two, after they've decided they understand the question, to then try to retrieve the relevant information from memory. Step three is to use those retrieved memories to form a tentative judgment. So they have to think about what they might want to respond with, what kind of information they might want to use. Step four is then to properly format that response. So to put it in the form of a statement, or to put it in the form of a number, or however that survey is asking them to respond. And then the fifth and final step that they must complete in order to respond to a survey question is to just look at their potential response and make any edits that they see fit. So the consequence of all this is that participants, while they might be trying to give you an honest and accurate response, as you can tell, anything can happen at any one of these steps to alter that response. So it can be pretty problematic, obviously. Like, take this example. On a survey, you may have seen a question like this before. How many alcoholic drinks do you consume in a typical day? And then you can see our 5 answer options are a lot fewer than average, somewhat fewer than average, average, somewhat more than average, and a lot more than average. So it seems pretty straightforward, right? Participants are just being asked, how much alcohol do you consume in a typical day compared to average? But there's actually a lot of stuff that can be quite confusing here. First of all, they have to make a decision as to what this question is actually asking. Like, they need to define terms like alcoholic drink and typical day. Like, by alcoholic drink, do they mean any drink that has any amount of alcohol? Does it mean a specific amount of, alcohol per other liquids that are in the drink? Like, exactly how do you define an alcoholic drink? Like, a beer is a drink, sure. But is a glass of wine just one drink? Are those two things equivalent? You can see how this can quickly get confusing. The other term, typical day, Like, what do you mean typical day? Because a lot of people, they drink alcohol more often on weekends than weekdays. So should we just look at, any particular day? Should we focus on the weekends? Maybe we should compute like an average score across an entire week, or maybe like an average score across an entire month or year, because there are holidays where people drink more often than others. I think you see where I'm going with this. So the participant has to make these kinds of decisions before they can even begin to retrieve the memories that are relevant to answering. The next thing that they're going to have to do is then try to retrieve those memories. And this could be quite difficult, especially if the question asks them to retrieve memories from long time ago. And then they need to decide which information is important. It should be, pulled from memory and used in responding. And then near the end of this process, they then need to edit the response. So, like, let's say they retrieve from memory that they drink 4.2 drinks per day on average. Well, is that normal? Like, how should they rate themselves? Because this answer scale that you see here, this doesn't have a number on it. So is 4.3, does that go on average? Does it go somewhat more than average or somewhat fewer? Like, they're going to have to make that decision. They have to define what average is in this case, because they're not told what that means. And if they do believe that they drink more than average, they have to make another judgment. Should they admit to that? Do they feel comfortable kind of like outing themselves as a person who drinks more than average? A lot of individuals might be sensitive about such topics and they won't want to make that admission. So even a seemingly very simple and straightforward question like this can be really complicated when it comes to trying to respond to it. So you need to try to take a lot of this stuff into consideration when you're crafting a survey. Like, one really important thing to consider is item order. So item order effects refers to when the order in which the items are presented will affect people's responses. This is kind of like a carryover effect that's a major source of confounds in surveys. And to avoid item order effects, you should put the unimportant and sensitive questions near the end of the survey. So as I always tell my students, you want to put the most important questions first, questions about the variables that are key to the hypothesis first. And then the other questions, the less important questions, things like demographic information, like what's your age, what's your gender, what's your ethnicity, like those kinds of things, those should be put at the end. Even if they're really important, and they are important to include in a survey, they should be put at the end because they're not that important regarding the hypothesis at hand. Another common source of confounds is called response option bias. So this is when an answer's options have unintended effects on people's responses. Now, it's important to include the full range of possible responses. Like, if you look at my examples down here, you'll see the one on the left, how do you approve of President Donald Trump? Completely disapprove, disapprove, approve, and completely approve. Well, that might be good enough. You might think that that's perfectly fine for like a political opinion survey, but what about the people who just don't care or are completely unaware of what the president's doing? Like, they literally have no opinion. It might be a good idea to include a no opinion option in this case. So yeah, the order of the options and the options that are provided can have a significant effect. And just in general, people tend to gravitate towards the middle response if there is a middle response, because there's this interesting psychological phenomenon where people just kind of assume that's normal. And humans like to be normal. Humans like to fit in and get along. Nobody wants to be a weirdo, right? So we just kind of naturally gravitate towards the middle response in a list like this. Now, you do want to have good questions, of course, and you do want to make sure the answer options are also, relatively free of these kinds of confounds. But what you might want to, what a lot of times you might want to do to just get additional information, much more detailed information, is to not even provide any answer options. To use what we call an open-ended question. So this is one type of survey question that you'll see quite frequently, where the survey just asks you to discuss some topic, to retrieve some information, and describe that information you've retrieved. So you're just allowing the participants to respond however they see fit. This obviously has some unfortunate consequences. Like if you let participants write anything they want, they often will write anything they want, and that can often be pretty useless regarding trying to, answer your hypothesis. So what a lot of researchers prefer is simply using those close-ended questions, where you provide a set of response options, like the previous rating scales I was describing. But as I already mentioned, then you have that response option bias to deal with. So there's costs and benefits to both of these. I recommend using both of them when it comes to doing your own survey, but close-ended questions should be the majority. Those are the ones that you're going to find much more easy to analyze and to, meaningfully test your hypothesis. But open-ended questions definitely have some strengths. When you ask a participant a question and allow them to respond in their own words, you get a lot more flexibility in what they say. They can go into detail about things that you never even thought to ask, and it can be very enlightening. But this can be a problem because, as I said, they might go off on some weird tangent that has very little, if nothing, to do with your hypothesis. So you kind of need to try to keep them on track as best as possible. Another problem with open-ended questions is that they do tend to be pretty difficult to analyze. While you can get a lot of really detailed information, it's really kind of hard to put numbers on that kind of information. This is like qualitative data. You can't easily code this kind of information. You can, it's just going to be a lot more effort, and sometimes it's practically impossible to do with any real efficiency. Here's some examples of some open-ended questions you might want to include in a future survey. So, what do you think about the current state of our election system? In your opinion, what is the most important change that needs to be made to the government? And please describe what you believe would be an ideal presidential candidate. So if you include questions like these, I'm sure you will get some really neat stuff from your participants. But as I already said, it might be hard to sift through all this detailed material and find some interesting bits of information. So that's why I recommend close-ended questions that provide a set of response options that the participants choose from. It's just like a multiple choice question on a test, or a true-false question. And true-false is basically just multiple choice with only two responses. But yeah, in general, I prefer close-ended questions for this reason. They're much easier to analyze, but you do have to worry about that response option bias. That's the big drawback. You need to make sure you include all the responses that participants would want, and you need to make sure that they're in the right order and they're properly formatted. So it takes a lot more effort to create a good close-ended question, but I think the effort is definitely worth it in the end. So here's a few examples of some close-ended questions. Are you for or against the legalization of marijuana? So generally, I don't like to have only two response options, but in this case, it makes sense because we're basically asking people, are you going to vote for this or not? Another one is, what is the most important issue in our country during this election? So what you see here, I included this fourth option of other. Usually when you include like an other option like that, the participant can write in what they want to say, what they want to choose. So it's kind of like a compromise between close-ended questions and open-ended questions. And then this third example you see here is a quite common close-ended question on surveys. It's please indicate your ethnicity. So in this case, you would just select one or more boxes to indicate which ethnic groups you identify with. And it is very common to see like an other option for this kind of stuff. One of the most popular question formats in close-ended questions is that of the rating scale. Now, rating scales provide an ordered set of responses that participants must choose from. And we use these things everywhere. You see them most classically on reviews for products or services. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard of the website Metacritic, but that's a scale from 0 to 100. A lot of websites use scales from like 1 to 5 to, describe how good a game is or something like that. So yeah, it's very common to see these kinds of rating scale type of questions. Now, the most popular rating scale format is called the Likert scale. This includes 5 points of responding, and it's named after an individual by the name of Rensis Likert. So those 5 answer options are strongly disagree, disagree, no opinion, agree, and strongly agree. Now, this is the most popular, but it does have a problem. No matter how well you format your survey and your answer options, there's always a potential for some confusion or some inefficiency. Like the problem with odd numbered scales like the Likert scale is like what I previously described. Participants tend to gravitate towards the middle. They gravitate towards that what they perceive to be normal value. So when you use a Likert scale, it's quite common for participants to choose either disagree, no opinion, or agree, but not really even consider going out into those extremes. And if everybody does just kind of gravitate towards the middle, that's basically going to provide you with no information. Like you don't want a lot of participants just sticking in the middle because they think that's what they should do. That's not going to be helpful. So I prefer even numbered response options because then they have to pick a side. Now, a rough guideline for writing questionnaire items, for writing survey questions, is provided by this model. We call this the BRUSO model, and each letter stands for a different quality. So the B stands for brief. You want to avoid long or overly technical wording when formatting your questions and answer options. R stands for relevant. You should only include questions that are needed to answer your hypothesis. And as I previously said, the questions that most directly answer the hypothesis, the most important questions, they should be placed at the very beginning. U stands for unambiguous. You want to try to make sure that your question can be interpreted in only one way. And this can be quite difficult to do by yourself, but when you are creating survey questions and their answer options, a good idea is to just ask other people what they think. Do a little beta testing, so to say. S stands for specific. So this refers to the participant's response options. It should be very obvious to the participant what their responses are referring to. You don't want there to be any uncertainty there. And then O stands for objective. You want to try to avoid any kind of biased language or format in your questions and answer options. You don't want to subtly kind of push the participants in one direction or the other. You want them to give an honest response. So the BRUSO model is a very effective way to write your questionnaire items. And I just wanted to include a few examples of how these can be useful. So for the first one, you see the first criteria, the brief. The bad example states, are you now or have you ever been the possessor of a firearm? Well, it's obvious what the question's asking here, but I think there's an easier way to say this. So take a look at this good example. The question is, have you ever owned a gun? So yeah, you can tell how that's much better. It just gets straight to the point, and when you do get to the point, when you are more brief like this, you do tend to potentially avoid confusion. Just look at one more example here. For the unambiguous criterion, check out that bad example. It says, are you a gun person? Well, that could mean any number of different things. Like maybe you're asking them if they really like guns, or if they shoot guns, or if they own guns, or if they're made out of guns. It's like it could be anything really. Like what does it mean to be a gun person? But if you look at the good example, the question that we're actually interested in here, what we really want to know is, do you currently own a gun? So if that's all you care about, just make that very clear. You don't want there to be any ambiguity in how the participant is supposed to respond to your questions. So the BRUSO model, as I already said, it's very important. When you're creating your own survey, I strongly recommend you go through every single one of your questions and just consider these 5 criteria. Another thing that's really important to do is you want to, at the very beginning of your survey, include a little bit of like a written introduction, just to, thank people for taking your survey and encourage them to respond in an honest and accurate way. This is also a good place where you could give the participant informed consent. So by that I just mean you're telling them what you plan to do with this data, who's going to be able to see their responses, and stuff like that. So just, a few sentences or a paragraph where you briefly explain to the participant what this is all about, to put it simply. And then if you need to give them specific instructions on how they should respond, that should come next. Depending on the kind of questions you're going to ask and how many questions, you might want to also break it up into separate sections. So you could put all your rating scale questions together, you could put your open-ended questions together, but that's more optional. Like you just want you want the survey as a whole to just kind of be orderly. You want it to be, you want it to look clean and organized in general. But as I said, the most important aspect of any survey is to put the most important questions first. Put those questions that most directly answer the hypothesis first, and put the least important questions at the end. And for most surveys, those least important questions tend to be the demographic kind of questions. But yeah, though you are going to put the most important questions first, you do want it to try to be organized like I was describing. And one final consideration is you need to keep in mind who you're going to be giving the survey to. You want the vocabulary you're using and the language style and even the language itself to be appropriate for your respondents. So if your respondents are college students, then you would use language that, a college-age individual should be able to understand. But if you're going to be giving your survey to children, you're going to have to reformat it, right? You're going to have to change and simplify the language you use in substantial ways in order to get honest responses.